Hello everyone, welcome back. So this week I've done a very large study on the Edward VII issues of Great Britain, and so I wanted to do a couple of videos to go through the more interesting aspects of this issue and the ones that cause philatelists more difficulty um, compared with other issues for the country. So just to give a broad overview of this issue, um, there are several aspects to collecting it that I'd like to touch on. So the first is the provisional printings, the fact that there are three main printing firms, De La Rue, Harrison, and Somerset House, that printed this set. Collectors may or may not be aware of that, but there were significant printings made after the death of Edward VII, but before the George V stamps were issued, or before they became widespread in England. And those are quite highly sought after by specialists, and they present some challenges to collectors. The second is the scarcity of fine used or very fine used stamps. Due to the fugitive nature of the inks. Another is the collecting of plate flaws and looking for plate varieties on these stamps, and the fact that those varieties are more significant than they first appear to be. And I think that's probably it for starters. I'll do a separate video on the actual identification of the different printings, but I'll wrap this up after I've given a brief talk about the issue with just some of the nicer stuff that's in the auction this week. So the first thing about this issue that is important to understand is the fact that most of the values are printed by up to three different printers. And it's very critical to understand the difference between them because there can be a significant change in value for some of the provisional printings. For instance, the 1 penny and halfpenny stamps, De La Rue, are common as muck. I mean, they're worth, in the catalog now, they list for $1.50 or £1.50 each, which is very, very high. I mean, in the past, these two stamps used to list for, 10 or 20 cents a stamp. I mean, they're basic penny stamps in the De La Rue printings. But if you're able to identify the Harrison versions of those, there are varieties that are hundreds of pounds if they're the right shade. And knowing your shades and knowing how to tell the difference between the printings becomes very important. And the same is true to more or lesser extent with the other values. So the initial printings made up until 1910 are all De La Rue. And there are some values that are only found in De La Rue printings. De La Rue is the default. Most of the stamps that you have, if you are sorting through a random lot of Edward VII stamps, most of them are going to be De La Rue. Okay, then Harrison, for a brief period, a few months in 1911 mostly, printed some of the more commonly used values. So the halfpenny, the 1 penny, the 2.5 penny, the 3 penny, and the 4 penny, and that's it. And they printed those, and also they used a different perforation of 15 by 14 for some of the printings, making those ones easy to identify. But they also did them in a perf 14, same perforation as the De La Rue. And those can be a little tricky to tell apart if you don't have experience with this issue. But once you know what to look for, they're fairly easy to spot. Um, and then Somerset House printed almost all the values with just a couple of exceptions. They did not print, excuse me, they didn't print the stamps that were printed by Harrison, but they printed all the other values. And again, their inks tend to be very distinctly different from the De La Rue inks. Now, the general difference between them, without getting into detail, which I'll save for another video, is the Harrison printings are much, much rougher than the De La Rue. De La Rue's are finely executed with clean lines and clear designs and good impressions. Harrison's have blurry, rough impressions. And Somerset House stamps are much better, much closer to De La Rue in terms of clarity, but they're not quite as good as the De La Rue's. And the main difference is the colors, which are distinctly different. Now, the second aspect I want to talk about here concerns the difficulty of securing fine used stamps. The Gibbons prices for stamps are quite high for this issue. And you see, if you go on eBay and you look in auction lots, I mean, you see this material selling for 5% of Gibbons in most cases. And that's not even the Gibbons prices with the premiums for very fine used, which jack them up even more. It's fairly important to understand what constitutes fine for the purposes of a GB philatelist versus what it would be in the States. So Great Britain is one of those countries that it had very heavy cancellations on its stamps, and and the colors suffer from inks being fugitive, and so they're very rarely ever found in the original colors. The catalog prices in Gibbons are for stamps that have perfect color as originally issued, and without the premiums, you're looking for stamps that have nice cancels, but they're not super crisp or super light, but they are legible, they are attractive, they're not smudgy, they're not heavy, or anything like that. So, a stamp that has, and I'll show you examples later in the video here, but a stamp that has a nice CDS cancel that might be a little on the blurry side or a little moderate to heavy would be an average cancellation for the purposes of the Gibbons listings. In order to qualify for premium treatment in Gibbons, they have to be genuinely knock your socks off superb. And so you don't see them that often, but when you do, they really genuinely are worth every penny of the Gibbons price, because they are very hard to find. As I explained in my auction video, the green and purple inks used on this issue were doubly fugitive, whereas the other inks like the blues, the scarlets, the reds, those were singly fugitive. And so singly fugitive is only runs in mineral spirits. So any of the colors, if you look at a typical lot of used stamps, you'll see that the reds, the blues, there's no problem. They always have the original color. But any stamp that contains dull green or dull purple or slate purple, usually will have a washed look or a faded look, or in some instances a very bright color that's not quite what the stamp was issued in. So for instance, the purple inks fade, first of all, to a very bright red purple. The dull greens fade to a very deep, bright blue-green initially when they first get exposed to water. Those are not typical De La Rue colors. And so when you see them in a lot, even though the stamps don't look faded, they technically are. And so, depending on the degree of fading, if it's not too bad, if it's at the very earliest stages of changing color, it's still collectible, but it's not going to be very fine or superb. It might be fine if all the other aspects to the stamp are good, but usually when you're collecting these, that's not the case. Most of the time, you're going to find with this issue, either the stamps are slightly off center, the perforations are crowding the design on one side, or there's a short perf, or there's some other small little fault that would take the stamp and reduce the grade. So, it's fairly difficult to find stamps that are free from any of those defects, that have the right color and a decent cancel. You'll find a lot of stamps that are fine, except they have just smudgy and unsightly cancels, or they have nice cancels, but the colors are clearly faded. And in both cases, you're talking about stamps that, for all practical purposes, are just fine or maybe even very good. So, it's a challenging area. I think it's a really good area to collect. I think if you're patient and you're discerning and you know what you're looking for, the market right now is very soft for this material due to the large amount of dreck that's on the market. And so if you could sort the wheat from the chaff, and you know your differences, and you're patient, you can put together a really nice collection of this issue without breaking the bank. So I think it's a good investment. Now, another area to look at, which I want to touch on very briefly here, is plate varieties. So, there are a number of flaws listed in Specialized, which may seem like fly specks to the casual observer, but plate flaws on any of these stamps are scarce to rare. As a case in point, I have in the auction this week, I think about a total of maybe 40 items with plate flaws. But those 40 items came from an examination of almost 2,500 stamps. So the percentage having some kind of flaw is very, very low. Very, very low. And so when you do find these varieties, they are worth collecting. And in my opinion, the Gibbons catalog, where they're listed, prices them quite high, anywhere from $30 to $80 or more a variety for mint. They tend not to price them in used condition, but for all practical purposes, they're almost as scarce used as they are mint. So they are very much worth collecting, I think. I will go through some of those in another video, but I'll show you just quickly, take it off the tripod here, and just show you very quickly an example of some of the nicer material that you can find. So just turn this off to reduce the glare. So there we've got a nice group of halfpenny stamps with cancels. Now these cancels here, these are all what I would call average for the fine used grade in Gibbons. None of these are superb, but they're definite solid fine stamps. Okay, that's a good shade. That's the bright green Harrison printing. So there's a nice copy of a De La Rue 1.5 penny with a nice cancel. So that would be that's a premium quality stamp for the purposes of Gibbons. You see it's a very nice light cancel here, struck with a feather touch. The stamp is centered, color's good. And that stamp is worth every bit of the catalog value, in my opinion. Very hard to find like that. Then here we've got the deformed tablet here, where you've got this large gap versus the normal tablet shape. That's a good stamp. That catalog's 550 pounds in Gibbons. And this one here is just probably a fine example. Maybe worth about half the Gibbons price. There we've got a Harrison printing of the 2.5 penny, so that's the blue, not the ultramarine. And again, very nicely centered. That's a moderate cancel. It's well placed. But again, see, that wouldn't be the premium grade. That would just be a fine used example. Here, this would be a premium grade. It's the De La Rue 4 penny orange, or orange red. And then we've got some other ones. 3 penny on chalky paper, De La Rue. Another De La Rue on chalky paper. That's a De La Rue printing with a nice cancel. This one here, that's the Carmine pink. That's the better pink Carmine shade of the frame. That's a De La Rue printing. Nice stamp. Here we've got a selection of the 1 penny stamps in the true scarlet shades. Again with, fine to very fine town cancels. Here we've got a plate flaw with a nice frame break here. And that's the only stamp I found amongst all of the 1 penny stamps I looked at, over 1,500 stamps, that had a demonstrably genuine frame break. Here we've got the Levant overprint on a Harrison printing of the 1/2 penny. And so that's a nice little overview of what this issue has to offer. Tune into my next video where I'll go through and discuss the differences between Harrison, Somerset House, and De La Rue printings. Thanks for watching. Bye.